Well, first of all, thank you to Bank Indonesia for hosting me today and to Forum Kajian Pembangunan as well. It's a great honor to be here and really nice to end. About 6-7 weeks I've been here in Jakarta. I'm almost ready to go home, so it's nice to end on such a positive note by speaking to you. I'm a lecturer, senior lecturer at Monash University in the Monash Business School. I actually teach business law to business students. So all the students doing economics and commerce degrees, they have to do a small amount of business law as part of their degrees. So I'm part of teaching those students. I actually have only been at Monash for about 6 months. Previously, I was teaching in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. I was in the law school there. And before that, I was a postdoctoral research fellow at Oxford University in the UK. And so maybe you can already see from the places I've been teaching that I'm interested in socio-legal studies, and particularly comparative socio-legal studies. So trying to understand the role of law in different contexts around the world. And of course, I'm particularly interested in Indonesia. I do most of my research here. I very much like coming to do my empirical research here and finding out a lot of things about the world, but particularly about Indonesia. I understand that some of you are interested in small and medium enterprises, so I hope that this presentation will be particularly of interest to you. My research is about socio-legal understanding the role of regulation, the role of law within small and medium enterprises in Indonesia. And particularly for today's presentation, I'm talking about labor regulation. So how law and how other kinds of regulation affect the way that workers are treated by their employers within different types of enterprise. So I would like to start with this fairly simple diagram. And I actually think this is a misleading diagram. So I'm going to begin with it, but I'm going to try and show you why it doesn't work. So this is not so I'm going to begin here, but try and destroy it throughout my presentation. I think this picture shows us the dominant way of thinking about informal labor around the world at the moment. So it shows here the idea that the state, by passing labor law, by protecting workers, usually only protects a certain percentage of the population. And this is seen as a failure of labor law to expand far enough to protect everybody, to protect all workers within a particular country. So I think in Indonesia, the estimate is that around 30% of all workers would fall in this green circle. They are covered by labor law and they are in practice and they are protected by the state law. What the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and many others have pointed out is that there's been a failure to protect the vast majority of workers, particularly in developing countries, but also in Western developed economies as well, that there are going to be a lot of workers who fall outside this sort of inner circle of protection. There is a problem here, though, which is that this kind of an idea is too simplistic, and it focuses on what's inside the green circle, labor law, but it sees what's in the blue circle, what's outside, as being a vacuum, as there being no regulation. So the workers who fall out in this part of the world are simply subject to market forces, and hence they're exploited, and their human rights and their labor rights are overturned and not followed in practice. What I want to show in my presentation is that this is misleading, because there is regulation in this blue area. what the ILO would call informal workers are still subject to all kinds of informal kinds of norms. And this is what I've been trying to discover in my research and trying to understand the interaction between the informal norms with formal labour law. Now, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and many of the countries that it tries to support through its activities, its policy is to formalize the informal, to try and expand this green circle so that it covers more and more workers, to improve law enforcement so that more and more workers are covered. And I think that's a laudable objective. It's a good objective. It will help with human welfare, with human protection, workers' protection. What I think the ILO is doing wrong is that it's ignoring all the informal regulation already exists. So it's not paying attention to it and not using it creatively in order to expand the protection for workers. So I'm going to try and explain this through the research I've been doing here in Indonesia. While it's being figured out, I will just keep going, I think. So the way we can start to unpick the ILO's perspective is to move beyond just thinking about law. And instead, we can think about regulation. And there are three kind of major definitions of regulation. The first two, which hopefully you have on your printout as well, is showing kind of state-centered ideas of regulation. We can talk about what the state does, the standards that it produces, and how it enforces them. But for my research, I am much more interested in using a much wider definition of regulation. All forms of social control, no matter who is creating it, no matter what institutions are involved. And once we broaden our view in this way, once we broaden our view and use this version of regulation, we can start to see the influences of all kinds of sources of regulation, whether they be patron-client type relationships, whether they be informal norms that everybody knows but no one's ever written down. Yeah, so it's this third definition that I'm using in my research as the sort of background framework for the way I'm designing my research project and then analysing the data that I found. So this project aims to move from this a traditional vision of labour law and instead to take a regulatory approach to the study of work arrangements. So I'm not interested in labels of informal workers or informal economy. What I'm interested is the label informal regulation. And this is a very subtle distinction, but it's really very important to try to understand. So we can call formal labour regulation is state labour law, essentially. The regulation standards that are set by the state government. Informal, on the other hand, can take many forms. It can be transnational private regulation through supply chains, through certification schemes, for example, where international NGOs will set standards which they then certify particular products. So these are standards and enforcement which is being created by state actors. We can also see it in other ways we can think about informal regulation are through, clusters of spatially linked businesses. So if you have a set of businesses which together kind of informally decide maybe the wages that they're going to pay their workers. So you might have a town where all similar businesses kind of talk to each other and they set wages or some other kind of condition. No, I mean like business owners. But labour unions are another regulatory actor for sure in this space. So we can see the role of labour unions. We maybe see the role of organisations that are not part of labour unions but nonetheless are interested in labour regulation. Maybe NGOs and other even individuals can be seen as regulatory actors in this space. And what they are doing, we can call informal regulation. We can classify it as informal regulation. So my empirical question that I'm using to underpin my research is what is actually regulating work. So I'm not assuming that labour law is fully functional. I'm simply going to that empirical question. What is it that's regulating work? Is it labour law? Is it something else? Is it some combination of them? And that's what I've been trying to find out in Indonesia. I'm particularly interested in interactions. So what happens when labour law starts to mix with informal kinds of regulation? What kind of outcomes do you get in businesses? And particularly here, again, small and medium enterprises is where this happens, where we can document this happening. So part of my research has been not only in Indonesia, but undertaking a very wide literature review as well. And a lot of the literature actually comes from anthropology, sociology, gender studies, political studies. There are lots of people out there describing how work is regulated, but they don't really use the words that I'm trying to use, which is regulation, maybe law, and trying to understand the interactions of different sources of regulation. So actually part of my research has been to do a really wide-ranging, worldwide study of the literature in this field. And I think from this survey I can categorize loosely some different sources of labour regulation. We can talk about institutions of social identity. These might include gender, age, marital status, ethnicity, religion, kind of background factors of identity which are then used within a particular business to arrange work. We also find a lot of the literature covering the idea of patron-client relationships, so ideas of reciprocity between an employer and their workers. Kinship is a big one, ties of kinship within the workplace. So in the Western literature, a lot of it says it's just focused on what happens in the workplace. But we can also see that there are lots of linkages between the workplace and the wider community. So this is where kinship can also become a regulating factor for working conditions. Self-regulation by business, so that's when business owners themselves are acting as regulatory actors, or perhaps together, so associations of businesses, whether formal or informal, can, as I mentioned before, can function as regulators. Self-regulation by workers, this is where we can talk about trade unions, but also unaffiliated worker associations, or even individual workers undertaking their own forms of resistance within the workplace. So dragging their feet, going slow, it's also a kind of regulatory activity as well. And regulation through civil society and consumer power. So this is where NGOs may certify a particular product and rely on ethically informed consumers to buy that product. And through that process, they end up setting particular standards for workers. Now, as I said, all this material comes from the anthropology, sociology literature, and it rarely has anything to say about labour law. And if we read the labour law literature, it rarely has anything to say about informal regulation. So my research is trying to fill this kind of interdisciplinary gap, this area where the sets of literature, the disciplines are not talking to each other. And that's sort of the background aim here. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about this particular research project that I've undertaken in restaurants in Indonesia. And I did the interviews in 2013, 2014 in 3 locations, 3 cities, in Yogyakarta, in Bandung, and in Manado. And you might say, well, why those 3 places? Well, it was partly just by luck, because I liked Yogyakarta a lot, so I thought I'd go there first. And then I had another reason for being in Bandung, so I added an extra city. And I thought, oh, that's a bit too Java-centric, a bit too heavy on Java research, so that's why I added Manado as my 3rd location to try to balance it. And I guess to try to test for the influence of ethnicity and religion on my results. So Manado, of course, being majority Protestant and different to the cities in Java. So that was the reason for selecting these 3 cities. I think I could have gone to many other places as well, and I can't generalize about the whole of Indonesia from my results, but I think hopefully I've done enough to be able to see the consistency across the findings. So what I did was interview workers and interview employers as well. And I did about 30 interviews in each city, so 90 interviews altogether. The interviews were semi-structured. So what I wanted to get from each interview was a picture, an overall picture of the work arrangement, the conditions of work for that particular person or for that particular business if I was speaking to the employer. So I asked about work history, I asked about personal background, I asked how was the person recruited, how did they get their job, I asked about wages, hours, discipline, social welfare, the relationships within the workplace between employees and also worker with their employer. I asked about leaving the employment relationship, so had anyone been fired in the workplace, how would that happen, and what the particular worker would do when they intended to leave at a later date. So I really tried to get a very full picture of what the worker's work arrangement looked like. And I selected the interviewees across a range of restaurants. So this is particularly in the restaurant sector. So that included very high-scale, expensive hotel kind of restaurants through to medium, mid-sized restaurants as well. Some of them franchises or, what's the word? When you have many of them. Banyak cabangnya. Those kind of restaurants, right down to warung tenda as well. So I really wanted a sweep of different types of businesses. And this is partly because I wanted to know how far labour law extended and then what happened in the places where labour law was not being used. So this is why I designed the research this way. Originally, I only spoke to workers because I thought workers would be more forthcoming about their work arrangements. Because I was afraid that employers wouldn't tell me the reality of how they were looking after their workers. But in the end, actually, the interviews with employers were more satisfying, more satisfactory. And I think they were telling me the truth. The employer, yeah. Because they had a wider view of why the choices they were making in their particular business and what they had changed over time. And I think they were telling me the truth. Employers didn't seem to worry about telling me that they were underpaying their workers, for example. Many of them did, and no one seemed to worry that there would be any consequences from this. So this was good. It meant that I got some really interesting research results as well. So the different interviews across the 3 cities and the different types of businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises up to the larger restaurants as well. Now, hopefully I can explain this, but what I was documenting is the empirical reality of work arrangements in particular places. But what I was interested in was the sources of regulation. What is it that's causing these outcomes? Now, you can imagine you have to kind of make a causal connection between what you can see in the interview data and the assumption that it was being regulated by something. So was it being regulated by labour law? Was it being regulated by informal kinds of regulation? Now, if the work arrangement said, we pay 1,200,000 rupiah per month, and that happens to be the UMR of that particular region, then, I can assume that it was following the labour law. the minimum wages for that particular place. But if it was not quite the same, or if it was some other forms of arrangement, it's hard to know what's causing it. Where's that coming from? And so I need to rely actually on the subjective perspectives from my interviewees. If they said they're following labour law, then I have to assume that that's what is actually going on. If they said they're not using labour law, they're using something else, then I took their word for it. So I'm acknowledging here the subjectivity of my interviewees and how that influences my perspective on what kind of regulation is causing what I'm seeing in the interviews. Does that make sense? It's needing to move from the empirical data, taking a step backwards to think about what's causing, what's the causal factor. Now, what I found, these are now moving on to my findings, and speaking to an Indonesian audience, perhaps you won't be very surprised about these findings. Actually, there are two very well-defined sources of regulation in Indonesia. The first, as you would think, the formal labour law, Undang-Undang Ketenagakerjaan, and the relevant regulations and so forth. But the second source of regulation is the idea of kekeluargaan. And it was very consistently defined by my interviewees across the three cities, Bandung, Yogyakarta and Manado. And most of my interview, I would ask them, well, what is your working conditions based on? And some of them would say, well, it's based on kekeluargaan, and this is how we do it here. So two quite consistently defined sources of regulation. It's different to my findings. We did a similar study in Australia as well, in Melbourne. And there, the sources of informal regulation were less well defined. They exist, but they were spread out, and there was not quite as much recognition by our interviewees. Here in Indonesia, kekeluargaan was very well defined by my interviewees, and consistent as well, which we found really interesting in the results. So we found a spectrum, as you might expect, of workplaces, work arrangements that follow labour law to a greater extent, and we could place them at this end of the spectrum. And workplaces that follow kekeluargaan to a greater extent, and we can place them at the other end of the spectrum. In the middle are some really interesting examples of businesses which use both. Some parts, yeah. So we might place some of the workplaces, some of the places where I interviewed, somewhere here in the middle, because they use some labour law, some aspects of it, but they also describe themselves as having kekeluargaan relationships as well. So what's interesting here is which aspects of the labour law are being followed and which aspects are not, and then how they're accommodating, or what other things they're using to regulate the work arrangements in their particular workplaces. So for me as a socio-legal scholar, it was the ones in the middle that were most interesting, because they can show us the interactions between the different forms of regulation.
And I think the most answers in the middle.
Yeah, actually a lot of them were in the middle. We did have some more towards this end, particularly high-end hotel restaurants, chains, more likely to be at this end. But none of the places I interviewed were perfectly following Indonesia's labour law. There's always some aspect of informality as well. And quite a number at this end, as you would expect, the warung tenda, the very small restaurants, but not family-run, but not always so small. Some of them at this end are also actually quite large. I interviewed one restaurant in Manado with 60 employees, and they were pretty close to this end of the spectrum as well. And this is 60 employees who are not related by blood. While the ownership might be family-run, they employ a lot of people, and they don't use Indonesia's labour law at all. So it's not always based on size of business, size of enterprise. Now, so we have this spectrum, kekeluargaan and formal law. We also have the influence of institutions of social identity. As I mentioned before, gender, age, marital status, ethnicity, religion as well. And these seem to interact right across the spectrum. And I think it's really important not to forget this. So we can find perhaps the influence of gender in all these types of arrangements. But they rarely function as rules. They're kind of ideas which influence both workers and employers, but it's not always like an understood rule. So let me give you an example. I could walk into a restaurant in Jogja and say, well, hey, I can see that all the employees here are male. And the employer would say, yes, I prefer to employ male workers. All my staff in the kitchen, they're all male workers as well. In fact, only men can be good cooks, he would say. And I think, oh, okay, all right. And then I would go next door to another restaurant, and I would see, well, actually here we have all female workers, including female chefs and cooks. And I would say to the employer, so what's going on with gender here? And maybe the owner would say, oh yes, it's much nicer to employ women. They're much more reliable, or they're much better cooks. So that's what I do here. So you can see that gender is influencing the choices made by an employer, but it's not across the board. It's not across an entire city. No one follows it like a rule that everybody understands. So that's a way of trying to show the influence here. Maybe another example in Manado, in particular, I would ask about religion. What's the role of religion here in the workplace? Does it play a role in how you decide what kind of employee to take on? And yes, in some cases, I mean, dependent, we're talking about restaurants, right? So if they provide pork in the restaurant, then probably they're not going to employ Muslims as employees. But maybe Muslim employees themselves wouldn't want to work there anyway, because they wouldn't want to handle pork products. Sometimes the employer wants to, they see themselves as having a religious role, so they want to make sure that they're educating their employees about their religious moral responsibilities. And hence they would only employ people of the same religion as themselves. But it's not across the whole society or across the whole city. So you just find examples of this, but it's not functioning like a rule. It's not a rule that everybody understands, if you like. That's just trying to explain how these institutions of social identity interact with both kekeluargaan ideals and with the formal labour law of Indonesia. So let me give you another couple of examples of the way that formal law and informal regulation interact. And the first one is THR, Tunjangan Hari Raya, and I'll also talk about in a moment kasbon, the borrowing money from the employer. But first to Tunjangan Hari Raya. So this is historically really interesting, because there are historical sources that show that giving a gift to your employees at the end of Ramadan has been a tradition in Indonesia for a very long time. There are sources that show that this was happening as early as the 1950s, maybe earlier. So this is actually an example of informal regulation that was eventually formalized by the Indonesian government through some different regulations that it passed, particularly the 1994 regulation on Tunjangan Hari Raya. Actually, you might know it's the legal status of this rule is a little bit wonky, a bit wobbly these days.
Isn't the kasbon is interest-bearing?
No, it won't be. No. Sorry to continue the story. So it's an informal idea, an informal practice, which was formalized by the Indonesian government. And then in my research, I could see the influence of the details of the formal law, formal regulation, even in like a keluargaan type work arrangements. So when speaking to employers, they would say, yes, I need to pay THR equal to 1 month pay, and I have to pay it to my Muslim employees at Ramadan, to my Christian employees at Christmas, and so on. And also the details about who they pay it to. If the worker has been there for 3 months, then you need to pay it, 1/3 of the, 1/4 of the 1 monthly wage, and so on. So the details from the regulation can actually find it influencing the practices of employers, even when they're not under any threat of enforcement by the Indonesian government, right? They're not afraid that they're going to get caught for not doing it, but they do it anyway. And that's what I found really interesting. We've seen an informal tradition idea become formalized and then have influence back again in informal practices. So I think that's one way of showing the historical interactions between the different forms of regulation. The second example, as I mentioned, is kasbon. And this is a practice I found in almost all of my interview results. No matter how formal or small the business, almost all employers were providing this facility to their workers. So this, of course, is where a worker, they have some kind of need. They need to pay their children's school fees. They need to pay their mum's hospital bill. Sometimes they need to buy a new mobile phone. And then they go to their employer and they say, hey boss, saya ada keperluan, minta tolong dan sebagainya. And the employer seems to be under quite a strong obligation to provide their workers with an amount of money that they've asked for on loan. And it's not interest bearing, it's never interest bearing. And then the worker will pay it back through cuts to their wages over time. There's no security here either. So it's based on a great deal of trust that the worker's not just going to disappear, pulang kampung dan tidak balik lagi. But it seems that this is very widespread. And the interesting thing is, you need a lot of trust for this to occur, but it's most employers feel under the obligation to provide it. Even in the very formal situations, I spoke to like mid-level restaurant managers in big hotels, and even though maybe the hotel business was not providing kasbon directly to the restaurant workers, the mid-level manager was doing it himself from his own pocket, because he felt the responsibility that was his responsibility to his workers to do this. And of course, there's no basis for this in Indonesia's labor law, right? It's not formalized at all, but it's a practice that is found right across the spectrum. I've never heard of any personal guarantee. But I guess there are some social ties. So often an employer knows where their worker lives, for example. They might know who their mum is. They might know, they've probably got the mobile phone. They've probably got some connection to that worker. So that I guess they feel that gives them the security that social pressure would make that worker stay long enough to pay back the loan that they've been given. I guess these are fairly small amounts of money, we're not talking a huge amount of money at once, but it's still substantial for these lower socioeconomic workers here in Indonesia. So these are just examples from my findings in my research. Now, I heard that some of you are researchers yourselves, so I thought I would be candid about the effectiveness of my research methodology for this project. It was actually really successful in gaining a sense of that spectrum of regulation, in trying to map how far Indonesia's labour law reaches, and then what happens when it starts to interact with kekeluargaan type norms. So that was the really effective part of the research project design. As I mentioned before, I did start with a focus on workers, but I shifted to being more interested in speaking to employers. But I think having the mix between the two is good because you can kind of check that you're getting the right story from different angles. Although I never interviewed in one workplace both the worker and the employer. I always just spoke to a worker or an employer in another place. So I didn't want my interviewees to feel that they were being spied on or being checked in that way. But as I said, employers were the most interesting and the most forthcoming about what was going on. Now there are a couple of problems though with this methodology. The first is that they were one-off interviews. I just spoke to each person once. And I only spoke to people currently employed in restaurants. And that means that I was speaking generally to happily employed people who are quite content with their employment situation. My method was less effective at gaining a sense of disputes in the workplace and unhappiness where it might exist. And I think if I were designing this project again, I would also try to follow any known conflicts or any known disputes in a particular city or a particular sector as well. So I wouldn't only be interviewing currently happily employed people, but I would also try to get a sense of the role of law and the role of informal regulation in resolving disputes as well. And the other thing that I didn't do as well as I might have liked was in pinpointing regulatory actors who might be outside the workplace, whether that's trade unions, whether it is maybe like the village head or a ketua RT, like what kind of role are these people playing as well? And my research doesn't extend as far as that. This slide, I guess, is so the first slide with the first diagram was the diagram I want to try to undermine and dispute against. This is the one I'm kind of working with now. The idea that we need to think about regulatory spaces in designing research of this kind, and we need to see the spaces as interacting with each other. So here I have an individual work arrangement as my kind of lowest level regulatory space. We can go a little bit wider by looking at individual enterprises. So remember that within an enterprise you might have different work arrangements for different members, different employees. But if we can go a little bit wider and see the enterprise as having the influence of formal regulation and formal and informal regulation affecting it. And you can keep getting bigger, I guess, and starting to try to map what's going on in a particular regulatory space and to try to understand the different regulatory influences. It's not a perfect diagram. It maybe looks a little too clean than the reality, but it's something that I'm using to try and explain what I'm finding in my research, if that makes sense. And finally, I would like to move on to just thinking about the policy implications of my research. First of all, we do need to be very careful about generalizing the results from one study. So this was just a one-off study in 3 cities in Indonesia. So these are not prescriptions for Indonesia necessarily. But I want to kind of just put forward some possibilities for how policymakers might think creatively, how they might use this kind of research to produce some creative regulatory design solutions to this problem of informal work, of workers who are not protected by law. So definitely I'm for shadowing this by saying these are not policy prescriptions because my empirical data is not enough to support that yet. But if you were to do more research of this kind and create a good enough empirical database, empirical knowledge base, then possibly we could move on to thinking creatively. And I think there are two ways that we can think creatively. One is more radical than the other. The first way is to use our knowledge of informal regulation to bolster the strength and effectiveness of the formal regulatory system. Let me try to explain. If we could see through the research that some aspects of Indonesia's labour law are stronger than others, have more are more effective, have more influence on practice, you could try to push those further alone. So you could try to push them further into the informally regulated sector by knowing that they've already got more traction than some other aspects. So let me give you an example. The minimum wage is very well recognised throughout my interviews, for example. Our workers, they may not know a lot about law, but they've heard about the minimum wage. So a policymaker could try to take that idea of the minimum wage and push it just a little bit further, give it a little bit more traction. Forget about the detailed, some of the other aspects of detailed aspects of Indonesia's labour law, by picking the aspects that really need to be enforced and putting resources and effort on those, because we already know that they've got some effectiveness already. Does that make sense? So to take the aspects of the law that are already quite strong and push them a bit further in the hope that they'll bring along the other aspects with them.
Do you think like incentive?
I mean, possibly incentivize or enforcement activities, resourcing and enforcement. So they could focus on the stronger aspects first as a way of trying to slowly formalise the informal. That's one way you could do it. Another way is to pinpoint what aspects of informal regulation are inhibiting formal law. What is it that people are adhering to that might not be useful for workers, and try to eradicate those first. So you already know what kind of unspoken norms are in existence in a particular sector, in a particular place, and try to really work against them. That's another way, that's another possibly creative solution that the state can do.
But the unspoken norms is mostly very strong.
Yes, that's the problem. So you need to know what they are, those unspoken norms, and try to undermine them, try to get rid of them somehow. But you can't do that if you don't know what they are to begin with. You just assume that it's a vacuum out there. So I think that's the ILO's mistake. It assumes that there's no informal regulation, there's no unspoken norms. And instead it just says we must enforce labour law. But it ignores these other aspects of it. Even there's some more radical possibilities here as well. I'm cautious about these because they're radical and we need to know exactly what the outcomes of them might be. But if we could show that informal regulation is good for workers, it does protect them, then the state could try to strengthen the beneficial parts of informal regulation and try to give them more power. So in my research, it shows that actually people using kekeluargaan type relationships are sometimes better protected than those on short-term contracts here in Indonesia. And maybe the Indonesian government might think about trying to strengthen kekeluargaan norms in order to help protect workers. And the ILO would not like this idea at all because it has fought hard for formal labour rights, and it would never want to entertain the idea of competing solutions. But I think we've already seen that the ILO's approach is not working. It hasn't been able to spread formal labour law far enough. There's so many workers not protected. So maybe we need to look at another kind of solution, which is to take existing norms, the good ones. There might be bad ones out there as well. We can't be too romantic about informal norms. But to identify which are the ones that actually protect workers and try to strengthen them. Maybe formalize them as law, or at least give them some kind of institutional protection. And it's difficult to think what that form that might take, but it is a possibility that I think we need to be thinking about more carefully. So we can separate them into the possibilities which strengthen the existing law by using informality, our knowledge of informality, or taking our knowledge of informality and really giving it a place within our regulatory system. I think the timing is right, so I'll just finish here by saying that I have actually published some of this research. The research on Yogyakarta only is published in a report available through the University of Melbourne Law School website. If you just Google this title, you'll find it quite easily. That's just the Yogyakarta research. I haven't written up Manado and Bandung separately, but our findings were quite similar nonetheless. So there's nothing surprising in the other two places that's all that different to the original research in Yogyakarta. So that's freely available. You can just download the report if you're interested. We also have a book chapter coming out later in the year where we talk in more detail about these creative regulatory solutions that we might think about once we've got informal regulation empirically documented. So I have a draft of that and I can send it to anyone who would like to read it if you'd like to send me an email. But hopefully with more research coming out, there is one published paper where I explain my findings between Australia and Indonesia. It was mentioned just before. But there's hopefully more coming out as well as we really look at all the great empirical data that was produced by this project. Okay, I think I'll end my presentation here and we can move on to Q&A if you like.
Thank you so much for the opportunity here. I want to congratulate your work. It's quite interesting because it really reveals the behavior of like the workers in the restaurant. The thing is like I fully agree with you that we do need more like sociological and anthropology approach. Even in my department I'm from microprudential department that deals with the financial stability, and it's really important to learn the behavior of, let's say, household or individuals that can strengthen their, let's say, repayment capacity to the financial system. And it turns out I fully, I can say happy because I saw that cash bond is a really it's a good non-interest bearing instrument that really strengthen their like transfer among household. I mean, maybe that's the key, that Indonesian household is really have a resilient against shocks because they have like in either like family transfers, and also I found out about the worker transfer as well. So, but like I just want to know your conclusion that your prescription about the more deals with the unspoken norms, which is for us personally, it's almost impossible to break the unspoken norms. Well, that's the first, and the second is like how to kind of stretch the formal regulations, because we need to have balance between, let's say, carrot and sticks. So, I mean, that's my question. Thank you so much.
Unspoken norms can change, and they do change. And the thing is, though, that it's hard to document how they change because it happens through natural interactions between people. They definitely do change over time, and they can change. The key question is, how can we do it deliberately? How can policymakers try to intervene in it? And I guess the underlying idea of law is that it will change the people's behaviour. If you pass a law and you enforce it, then you will produce the outcomes that you want. That's the theory, that's the ideal. We know in practice that you can pass a law and no one pays any attention to it. So the real key, and I think it's a complex, very complex problem that policymakers face, is how to pass a law and really make it work as intended. If you've got a very strong authoritarian state, you can maybe do it by force, but people don't really like that, and they'll still try and follow their own unspoken norms nonetheless. The idea is to try to persuade people that this is the right thing to do, and to try to change attitudes along the way.
It's like breaking a cartel or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem, and I think maybe what we need is kind of more like active action research to try some different possibilities and see how people react to them. And if it works, then maybe expand it to a larger project. We can maybe change through changing the discourse. If we create a strong enough discourse, a strong enough way of speaking about a particular problem, that can help to change attitudes and slowly to change informal norms as well. Maybe an example from a different area is the idea of domestic violence. If you call it a problem, you give it a name, and you get people talking about it in the public arena, and slowly people start to recognize the idea that this is a problem. So previously the idea of domestic violence, the activity existed, and then it was given a name and called a problem. And maybe there were laws passed to try to solve that problem. If you talk about it enough in public space, it starts to change people's attitudes. And maybe that can be like a strategy in the labor regulation space as well.
Thank you for opportunities. I have questions. Maybe it's about comparative. First, about comparative. Could you distinguish, maybe in a bit simple way, about the different regulation, whether it's informal, either informal or formal one, in developing country and developed country or advanced country? Because to create the regulation, especially the formal one, to be in the middle, meet the everybody expectation, it's not like it is easier said than done. So, but then the role of worker, but also the role of the employer is also important for the, let's say, GNP or GDP. So how do you see about this? First, I also have curiosity about, because when you mention, you explain about some examples, informal, and then do you see it means that when the informal one, for example, maybe from international human rights aspect, for example, there is discrimination, gender discrimination, many things, yeah. It is actually also meaning that the country is not responsible to provide equal rights, but then sometimes equal norms is stronger than the former one. So how do you see this? Maybe it's about comparative, not only Indonesia or Australia. And then last but not least, I'm also worried about the development of technologies these days. In Indonesia, we can see the example of people who used to work in the toll. Now they replaced by electronic toll, for example. But that's not only happen in Indonesia, even in advanced country. the development of technologies is taking so much of the workers. So do you see that the regulation, whether it's formal or informal one, it's allow it to some extent to prevent the hyper development of technology, which taking the worker opportunities? Because if we refer to Oxfam research, where they say that 1% people who are who have the wealthy is about 82%. So 1% have 82% from the whole of the wealthiness. So yeah, I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Comparison. So this research is part of a comparative project. So we did do a similar set of interviews in Melbourne, in Australia. And the framework that we can use of formal and informal and the spectrum of regulation holds true in both places. So we found it in Melbourne as well. And so we have the influence of Australia's labour laws, and we also found a lot of informal regulation too. So some of the examples are, there's an unspoken rule in Melbourne that all employees in Asian restaurants are paid $8 an hour, which is about half the minimum wage. So but it was quite stable, quite consistent across the different workplaces. And it means that everyone kind of understands that this is what they're going to get paid if they work in a Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian, Filipino restaurant in Melbourne. We also found other interesting things, like in an Italian-dominated part of Melbourne. So it's this, a very famous strip of restaurants where they're all Italian. And again, we can see similar conditions across all those restaurants, also below the minimum wage. And some similar ideas about how work should be regulated there. I think the differences between Indonesia and Australia are that in Indonesia we have this very well-defined source of informal regulation, this idea of kekeluargaan. And quite a lot of people were not worried about not following the law here. So you ask them, so why do you use kekeluargaan? They say, oh, we're not a limited liability company, we don't need to. And no one seems to find that worrying. In Australia, we found so not quite so well-defined sources of informal regulation, kind of patchy. We would find clusters of businesses doing similar things, but not across the city similarities. And the interviewees were not able to articulate a sense of what informal regulation, they couldn't give it a name like they can here. And there, people were a bit more unsure of themselves. They knew they weren't following the law, and they were a little bit worried about it. Not very worried, but a little bit worried. So I think that's kind of the difference. But when we look at the statistics of how many people are formally regulated or informally regulated, of course in developing countries the numbers for informal is higher. So in Indonesia we know it's 30% formal, 70% informal, more kind of. In India it's worse, it's 10% formal, 90% informal. And that's actually an outcome of the law itself, because India's labour laws are restricted to certain size enterprise, they have very detailed exemptions from the law. So that's part of the reason, and then it's also enforcement as well, like Indonesia. So I guess that's some of the comparison. A lot of the informal norms do cross countries though. Ideas of reciprocity, like patron-client type relationships, ideas of kinship in the workplace, fictive kinship, which we find in Indonesia through the idea of kekeluargaan. You can find that in other parts of the world as well. It's not given the same name precisely, but it's still a similar kind of idea. The second part of your question about technology, that's not something I have addressed in my research. I know a lot of labour lawyers are very worried about the new gig economy, for example, the Uberization of work, maybe you would call it here, maybe the Gojekization of work. I'm sure that there's still informal regulation affecting that process, but it's not something that I have tried to document in my research. So I'll leave the rest, I won't say too much more about that particular question.
Good morning. Now, some literature recognize there is some kind of labor segmentation in the informal labor market. The first segment being those who see informality as an opportunity. It gave them some competitive edge. Now, there are other segments that see informal as a last resort because they have no place in the formal economy. Now, during your interview, did you observe such segmentation in Indonesia?
Through my interviews, I found some really interesting attitudes towards the choice between formality and informality. As I said before, a lot of workplaces, both workers and employers, said, oh, we don't need to follow Indonesia's formal law, we're too small. So we don't need to, that's one aspect. But there are others who said we choose not to because it's better. So I spoke to some workers. I'm thinking of one particular young man. Previously he had worked in I think a chemist, like a pharmacy, with a fixed term contract. So he had been employed formally previously. And then when he moved to becoming a chef in a restaurant, he was quite multi-talented, moved to becoming a chef in a restaurant, and where it was kekeluargaan regulated. And he said he liked it a lot better. He was paid less, but he was happier. And it was because the workplace was more relaxed, more flexible. He didn't feel like he was being ditindas, like kind of oppressed.
It's like a fresh benefit.
Yeah, he really liked it, even though he was paid less. Now, that's an interesting example. But then, speaking to employers, why do you use formal law or kekeluargaan? Sometimes they said, well, I just can't be bothered, you know. It's easier to use kekeluargaan, I don't need to worry about formal law. Some people said, actually, I'd like to formalize the way I regulate my employees, but I can't because kekeluargaan is too strong. I can't force my employees to change their ways. So the employer actually felt a bit powerless against the informal regulation. So it's really the stories that people tell you, the justifications for a choice of one or the other, I find really interesting in my research. As for seeing it as an opportunity, not really. That's not what the employers were telling me. They're not really, they just wanted to run their business as best they could in most cases. They weren't really thinking, oh, I've got to be in the informal economy because it's, I don't need to underpay my workers or whatever. It didn't seem like that at all when I was speaking to employers. So I haven't quite answered your question, but I'm just showing the different attitudes among the different interviewees as to the choices being made between formal and informal. What's really key here is that through the stories people tell, they are distinguishing these two things. They're saying that's the formal, this is the kekeluargaan way of doing things, and they're different. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why it's so hard to formalize the informal, because people are always distinguishing between the two and saying where the formal law applies and where it doesn't, if that makes sense. So if someone says, oh, formal labor law only applies in big companies, I'm not a big company, I don't need to do it. If they keep telling that story over and over again, then everyone starts to believe it. And it becomes a discourse that everyone kind of, yet another unspoken norm, I feel like.
During your survey, have you make a survey to the employer perspective? Because I'm interested how they make training in informal for career path of their employee. Because in a formal, like in a bank, commercial bank, there is rule that to the certain of human resources costs should be allocated every year around 2%. But in informal, I don't believe they, because of kekeluargaan. But from the employer perspective, they have to train their employee to make sustainable in the business. Otherwise, they will extinct from competitive advantage. Like a restaurant, they have to train taste, price, quality, I believe. And I believe one of the awareness of the employer, once you train your employee with maximum, they will quit and they open their restaurant, new restaurant, and it will be a competitor, right? This is, so again, my question is, how do you train their employee in informal, of course?
I think the key here is that in restaurants, you can train people quite quickly. Waiters, cashiers, cleaners can mostly pick up skills quite quickly. They don't need a lot of training. It's the chefs that are key here. And it's chefs who can often claim a lot bigger salaries because they do have a particular skill that the restaurant might need. I don't think in the small and medium enterprises that I was looking at, I don't think they spend a lot of money or time on the training. They might just put the new employee with the existing ones and say, follow along and you'll figure it out. Yes, there is a risk that if you spend money training a chef that they might leave. They're the ones that business owners need to keep so that their business can keep going. You can replace waiters very easily. A lot of the people working in the restaurants had the ambition to one day open their own enterprise. And I guess a lot of them were saying, yeah, I'm looking for experience first. Lagi cari pengalaman. And then one day, I hope, I'll open my own enterprise. But I don't think the business owners were worried about this. It didn't seem to be something that they were telling me they were trying to keep their employees or, Oh, no, I just remembered. The secret recipes, that's one thing that employers don't want their employees to run off with, and they can be very upset if that happens. But again, in the informal sector, how do you prevent that from happening? You do it through loyalty and through reciprocity, those kind of ideas. But you can't prevent it from happening, essentially.
How do the salary between chef and other employee, the gap, I mean?
I can't remember the exact differences. I wasn't always able to ask the exact salary from my workers. It's one thing that they were hesitant to tell me precisely. It's quite a rude question, isn't it? How much do you earn? But for sure, the chefs were earning more than the waiting staff. But I'm not quite sure what the difference is there. Yeah. I think if thinking about my methodology, if I were redoing this research, I would be a bit stronger or a bit more determined to ask exactly how much people were earning. But you also need to ask them, how much do you earn as your basic wage? What bonuses do you, daily, weekly, monthly bonuses do you get? What other facilities are provided to you? Do you get free food as part of your employment package? That kind of thing. You need to ask all those questions to get that answer. A lot of employees in restaurants are given accommodation by their employer, either behind the shop or in the employer's own house, and you need to take that into account when trying to figure out all the benefits that somebody gets.
How do you think the results or the findings that you have in the restaurant sector, services sector also can be translated to, for example, other sectors. Transport, we're talking about Gojek versus the ordinary Ojek, for example. Anything that you can think of found other sectors?
So I haven't done any research in other sectors in Indonesia yet. So I can't say for sure. Until you go out and do the empirical research and know for sure, you don't know. I suspect that the idea of kekeluargaan, because it's so strong and consistent in my results, that it would also extend into other sectors. Particularly maybe shop assistants. I think that would be quite common. Gojek and those kind of relationships might have their own sets of rules because often the motorbike is hired from someone who owns it, and then they might be paying back a certain amount per day. For Ojek, yeah, maybe even for Gojek, if you've got riders riding somebody else's motorbike, and there might be all sorts of relationships going on there that could be researched. We chose restaurants, or I chose restaurants to research in because I knew I would get this clear spectrum between formal and informal, and that we would get the same kind of result in Australia because we know that restaurant sector is notorious for being underpaid and so forth. So that's why we chose that. But I think this kind of study could easily be expanded to look at other sectors as well, to try to uncover the unspoken norms there.
Round of applause for Ibu Petra. Yeah. I'm not going to try to summarize the discussion, but I think one of the key takeaway for all of us is how norms can also regulate so that the informal sector is not that a lawless place without regulation, but there is actually some kind of norms being implemented. And this actually, I don't know, I don't like to raise this most of the time, but it raises back to the question of Pancasila, yeah, which is musyawarah dan mufakat, which is basically a norm being followed by Indonesians previously when things are not formalized in state laws. So with this, maybe I thank Bank Indonesia again for hosting, and that remind everyone that there is one more event which actually will be presented by Pak Iwan Setiawan on a very hot topic, I think very current, on cryptocurrency. Yeah? Should we get on the cryptocurrency bandwagon, opportunities and challenges, gitu ya Pak ya. So thank you again, and hopefully to see you next week.